Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again, like every month, to think about what is intelligence and what parts of science can help us answer our questions about its mechanisms in mathematics. So we are Cross Labs, a research institute based in Kyoto, and we are also a sort of a new kind of research center and university embedded in the industry. So you can check out our website. It's cross, like cross, and labs, like labs.org. And we are part of a leading AI company in Japan that is funding us, called Cross Compass, where the cross comes from. And this event is co-organized by many people now, but Antoine, Katze, Annelies, and Stephen behind the stage. But also many other people that I thank. And we have those every month or so, and having fun about thinking about different aspects of intelligent sciences. And today we have the pleasure to introduce Grace Lindsay. Hi, Grace.
Hello.
And Grace is a computational neuroscientist and an author. Recently, she wrote a very nice book called Models of the Mind: How Physics, Engineering, and Mathematics Have Shaped Our Understanding of the Brain. Very nicely written, popular science book about how and why we use mathematics to understand the brain. So she received her PhD at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at Columbia, working with Ken Miller. And she's now at Sainsbury Wellcome Center, Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit. So she's a research fellow at University College London, working on building functional and interpretable models of sensory processing. So today we have the chance to have her talk at Crossroads about building mathematical models of the brain. So Grace, anytime, the channel is yours.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I'm interested to see how the discussion goes afterwards. So the brain has been called the most complex object in the known universe. It's not clear kind of who originally said this, and it's also not really clear what exactly it could mean, because how are we defining complex and how are we defining object? But I think it's safe to say that the brain is complex. It's very complex. It's made up of, in the case of humans, 100 billion neurons, and neurons aren't even the only cell type in the brain. There's also as many or more glial cells. And then there's, the circulatory system and other bodily systems that interact with the brain. And all of these neurons form trillions of synapses with each other, trillions of connections to create this very complex physical web. And each individual neuron has many different processes that come out of it. They can have different shapes. They can use different molecules and proteins. And so the brain is structurally very complex, and then also it's functionally very complex because it produces all of the behavior and thoughts and actions that we have and that we do. So anytime, an athlete does something impressive, their brain is playing a big part in that. Anytime someone, writes a poem or thinks a thought, or doing things that we're not even thinking of, like regulating our heart rate and breathing and hunger and thirst. The brain is just constantly doing a really diverse set of things. It can be very context dependent. It can produce action on long time scales and short time scales. So it's structurally complex in the physical objects, and it's functionally complex in the function that it produces for us. And that's why it's been so adaptive to have big, useful brains. But so despite the fact that the brain is so obviously complex, the study of the brain has been, throughout a lot of the history, been in a more qualitative regime. So in the history of neuroscience, you'll have studies about lesions where animals or humans who are in unfortunate accidents have part of their brains removed or missing. And we say, oh, when that part's gone, this person is more angry or less able to see, or things like that. And even when we started recording from neurons in the brain, the kind of conclusions that were drawn were also still pretty coarse and qualitative. We can say this neuron fires more when the animal is in one environment versus another or something like that. And so the study of the brain has not, in certain ways, matched the complexity of the object itself. And this is understandable in many ways. It's very hard to study the brain, especially the human brain, in humans that are walking around and doing interesting things that demonstrate what the brain can do. And the study of the brain comes more from the history of psychology on one side, which has been explicitly almost non-scientific at parts of its history with things like Fortean analysis and all that. And on the other side, it comes from biology, which, is usually not thought of as a super quantitative field, at least in its history. And so the fact, though, is that at various points in the history of the study of the brain, people have been taking in concepts from more mathematical fields. And that trend of using mathematics to understand the brain is growing now. And I think it's super important and necessary that we use mathematics and mathematical modeling to understand the brain, exactly because of its complexity and because of the complexity of the behaviors we are trying to understand that the brain produces. And so this is basically the field of computational or theoretical neuroscience. That's the field that uses mathematical methods to study the brain. And that's essentially what my book is about. It's kind of a summary of all the different areas that have been, touched by an interaction with physics or engineering or mathematics that are really, ideas about how the brain works. It ranges from how individual neurons work through how populations of neurons interact and up to models of behavior. So it's really the whole range of what we call neuroscience that's been touched by mathematical modeling at some point. So I just wanted to showcase in this book, one, that this field exists, that people are doing this, because I've met a lot of people in my life who didn't know that people use math to understand the brain. I also wanted to kind of provide a written history to the field, because even people in the field don't really know the full extent of the role that mathematics and interactions with more quantitative fields have played in the history of neuroscience and of computational neuroscience. So that's kind of what the book is about. But then also on top of those kind of major motivations for writing it, I also wanted to just stress some themes that exist in mathematical modeling generally, but also of the brain in particular. And so one of those themes is that no model is perfect. This is expressed in different ways, that you don't want the map to be equal to the territory. You want to be reducing and simplifying and pulling out the useful bits when you make a model. This shows up in modeling, because when you build a model, especially if you work in research building a model and you put out a paper, there will be people who tell you that, oh, well, your model is missing this important thing that I study, is usually how it's motivated. And so people will always be able to identify what your model doesn't have. And sometimes that's used as a critique, but in fact, it is very important that models don't have all of the details, because then they wouldn't be useful as a model. The point of the model is to abstract away some things, and also the art of modeling is to know which details are important for what you're trying to explain it and which details aren't and can be ignored. And so that's one of the themes. And then kind of the flip side of that is that multiple different modeling approaches can be used to understand the same thing. Because if each model is only giving you a partial view of the thing itself, then it makes sense that we can kind of have multiple views on the same thing. And so that's what I'm going to demonstrate in this talk. I'm going to specifically talk about a few different approaches to modeling the visual system. And these approaches have their own long histories, and they come from 3 different chapters of the book, just to highlight kind of how diversely we can look at the same thing. So just quickly, this is broadly what the visual system looks like. So obviously light comes in through the retina. It makes a stop. The information, is transmitted through neurons that come out of the retina, and they make a stop at the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is a subcortical area, meaning it's below the wrinkly bit of your brain. And then from there, it goes on to the first area of the first visual area in the cortex itself, which is called the primary visual cortex, and that's right at the very back of the brain. So information is kind of going from your eyes and shooting straight to the back of your brain. And then from there, it kind of gets sent to multiple different processing streams, depending on what information we want to extract from this, the visual information that is coming through the retina. And for example, one of those streams would be what's sometimes called the what pathway, which is, what am I looking at? What are these objects? Versus a pathway that might detect more things more associated with motion, which we call the where pathway. So that's kind of the basic setup of the initial stages of the visual system. And in the 1960s, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel were professors in the Boston area who were studying the visual system. And at that time, a fair amount had been studied about the retina, and a fair amount had been studied about that subcortical area, the lateral nucleus, but they were trying to understand this primary visual area, the part at the back of your brain. And to do that, they put electrodes in the brain of a cat in their primary visual cortex, and basically, as was the style at the time and still is largely the style, you just kind of listen to what those neurons are responding to. You show the animal different things, and you try to understand what causes the neuron to have an action potential, to have activity in response to the things that you're showing. And I'm going to show a video here of kind of one of their experiments where they were showing a bar of light to a cat. And you'll notice that what they saw is that there was a certain location and a certain angle of that bar of light that caused the neuron that they were recording to at that time to respond, and other locations and angles did not. And so you're going to hear the neuron. So the way that it works is you put an electrode in and then you translate, the signal that electrode is picking up into sound. That's how the experiments would work, so that they could be doing things while trying to hear the neuron. And you're going to see what was on the screen. So you should hear a staticky sound with some bips. The bips are the neuron firing. This is the bar of light that they're showing the animal. You can hear it's firing a lot right now. So when they put this bar at this location, it causes the cell to fire. And so he's just marking on the screen where the cell is firing. And then when you put the bar at other locations, it's not firing. And in fact, it only fires when the bar turns off at those locations. So see, on either side of this main point, you get points that seem very similar. The bar is very similar and in a very close location, but it's not causing this neuron to fire. And so he's marking that on the other side. And then he's going to do a sweep in a different direction to show that the neuron only responds when the angle of the bar of light is correct. So the closer you get to that angle, the more it responds. So this was what they called a simple cell, and this is just another depiction of how that cell responds. It responds when the bar of light is in the right orientation, in the right location. If you put it next to that location, it will only respond when the light goes off, and if you put it in the wrong orientation, it won't respond at all. So that's what neurons in the primary visual cortex are responding to. They called these simple cells because they also found a set of neurons which they called complex cells. And those were similar in the sense that they cared about the orientation of the light. It had to be aligned the right way, but they had a wider range of locations where that bar of light could be. So they would respond even if the light was not exactly in the center of their preferred location. It could be wiggled around a bit. So those are the two main cell types that Hubel and Wiesel discovered in the primary visual cortex of cats, and we have them as well in lots of other animals. And they basically believed that the way that these two different cell types related to each other was that the complex cells basically got input from multiple simple cells. So if each of these simple cells has a very narrow location that it prefers, if you just kind of sum up the activity of many different simple cells, then you can get a complex cell which will respond if the bar is in any of those locations. So that's the basic setup that they came up with how complex cells arise from simple cells. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, an engineer at a Japanese radio station heard about the work of Hubel and Wiesel and wanted to make an artificial visual system. And he based it on these basic principles that there are simple cells and complex cells, and the one feeds into the other. And this model is called the neocognitron. And through that kind of mapping of Hubel and Wiesel's work to a mathematical system, we eventually came to this simple picture, which says that simple cells are like convolutions. They look for the same pattern at every different location. So there'll be multiple cells that have the same preferred orientation that span the whole visual field. So they're like a convolutional filter being passed over an image. And then the complex cells are like a pooling operation because they take in a bunch of simple cells that look for the same orientation, but they just pool over a larger region of visual space. And so today, convolutional neural networks are a form of deep neural network that powers most of artificial vision that we use today in social media and self-driving cars. You'll see convolutional neural networks. And they just work by repeating these operations of convolution and pooling and convolution and pooling. And then you train the whole network to classify the images that you have an interest in. And so training means setting the weights of the convolutional filter. So it means setting the patterns in the image that these different artificial neurons are responding to. And what is interesting is that if you look at the patches of image that are good at driving neurons in the first layer of these artificial neural networks, you can see that those artificial neurons seem to prefer lines in certain orientations. So each 3x3 grid here is image patches that drive an individual neuron. And then there's 9 neurons in the larger 3x3 grid. And you can see that these neurons have preferred orientations. They're looking for specific orientations in the image. So they're recapitulating what the primary visual cortex does. And even more than that, we can actually show a convolutional neural network and the brain through showing an image to a person or an animal and record from the neural activity in the brain, and we can actually use the convolutional neural network to predict how neurons in the brain will respond. And it's one of the best ways that we have right now to predict how neurons in the visual system will respond, is to show them to a trained convolutional neural network. So that's the first way we can understand or model the visual system, is through convolutional neural networks. And they're kind of they're based in the structure of the system itself, and they do a good job of predicting neural activity. So the next approach comes from information theory, which was developed by Claude Shannon during World War II, which was kind of a theory of communication, but also then required a formalizing of the concept of information to talk about how information could be transmitted. And so in Shannon's system, you have a code that you're sending symbols from across a channel to a receiver. And that's kind of the basics of it. And in his theory, the best code that you can have has low entropy. And so that's a function of how frequently each of the symbols are used. And maybe it's not surprising that very shortly after this theory of information and communication came out, people thought, oh, this seems relevant to the brain because the brain is made up of areas that are sending information to each other. And so it seems sensible to talk about what code is the brain using to send information between areas, between all these channels that the brain has. And so an idea that really took hold in neuroscience was the notion that you would want to use a very efficient code. And by that, it's meant that you would want to use a code that doesn't require too many neurons to be active at any given time, because neuron activity, the actual firing of a neuron, is a pretty energy expensive thing for the brain. And so the best code will still carry a lot of information, but it will do so with very few spikes. It will do so with very little activity of neurons. And so one way to think about this is, you want to produce some sort of signal that has the information that you want, and you're going to produce it by combining entries in a dictionary that represent, different subcomponents of the possible information you want to send. And then you're going to weigh each of those dictionary entries, and that weighing vector should have a lot of zeros. It should be very sparse. It should only pick out a few of these dictionary entries to use to recreate the signal of interest. And so in the neural case, that means that each of these neurons represents a dictionary entry, and you only want to have a few of the neurons on. But then how should that dictionary be generated? What should the entries in the dictionary be that will be useful to make this happen? It'll be designed such that you only need a few of them to create any signal that you want. Well, that's going to depend on the signals you're trying to represent. So in the case of the visual system, the signals, that you're trying to represent are images. They're, the type of information that comes into the retina, which we can think of as, pixels in an image. And so in this 1996 study, Olshausen and Field used kind of this notion of efficient coding to figure out what would be the best dictionary for the visual cortex to have if it wanted to represent images, but do so with only sparse neural activity. And through their calculations, this is the kind of entries that they found. This is what the dictionary should contain. And as you can see, these are little patches of space that have preferred orientations and different spatial locations, and they have regions, where the weighting is high and the weighting is low of the image, and so they're really recapitulating what we see in primary visual cortex. These are basically the types of, patterns that the simple cells respond to. So that's another way to look at the visual system, and it's more of a way of answering kind of a why question about the visual system. Why does it have the responses that it does? And it turns out, oh, well, maybe it's because it's the most efficient way to represent visual information. But so far, I've been kind of talking about the visual system as a very bottom-up system where there's an image that comes in and the cells respond, and that, that could work in very simple settings where you don't have any ambiguous stimuli, but the real world is exclusively ambiguous stimuli because we're always trying to make a 3D understanding from a 2D projection. And this is shown kind of very clearly with the Necker cube illusion, where you can see this as kind of a box that comes out and down to the left or out and up to the right, depending on, what you're focusing on it, or just what naturally comes to you when you look at it. And to think about how the visual system could engage in this kind of, ambiguity resolution, or this even have this type of illusion, it meant that people had to think about more than just, the visual system itself. They kind of had to think about a bit of a broader context that would come into visual processing. And this is where Bayes' rule turns up in neuroscience and in cognitive science. This is one of the many places it turns up. And in Bayes' rule, what you say is that the probability of the hypothesis given the data, so in this case, the probability that the box is going down and to the left, given the visual information that I'm getting at this moment, is proportional to the likelihood times the prior. So that's the probability of the, that should be the data given the hypothesis times the hypothesis, the probability of the hypothesis. So the prior is the probability of the box being down and to the left or up and to the right. And so that's not actually based on what you're seeing in the moment. The probability of the box being either way or the other, not given the information that's coming in at the time, that just comes from somewhere else. That's why it's called the prior. It's just prior information that you might have coming into this visual setup. And so a lot of studies have been done to kind of ask, are people Bayesian, are brains Bayesian? Do they seem to incorporate prior information in this way? And one example of a study that looks at that is this one that I'm showing on the left here, where they show people an oriented line, because we know that this is the stimuli that the primary visual cortex responds to. And they show an oriented line over and over, moving through space. And then you can imagine that, you would expect the line of the same orientation to then move to the middle of the screen based on its trajectory. And they show these kind of sequences to people. And on some cases, they show 50% of the sequences they show do have the line just carrying on as you would expect, as it does in this example. And then for a different group of people, they just show random line orientations in the sequence. And the question is, does the expectation that the line will carry on in the way that it's been going, does that kind of mess with people's priors? And what I'm showing on the right here is that in the case where most of the time the line does carry on the way that it's been going, people actually are worse at discriminating the orientation of that line when it unexpectedly doesn't do that, because they have a prior that's pushing their representation of the image in the direction of the prior. So that expectation that the line will be in a certain orientation at a certain location is kind of changing their actual perception of where the line really is, because that prior information is coming to bear on the equation in Bayes' rule. And so this is an entirely other way of thinking about visual processing as Bayesian inference in terms of trying to understand what the real world is, given the information you have now, but also importantly, incorporating information that you've kind of gained over the recent past or your lifetime or even evolution. So each of these different approaches, they all miss certain aspects of the visual system, including a lot of things I haven't even talked about. And, some of them cover things that others don't, but none of them are really wrong. They're all offering a different perspective on the same system. And I think that's just really core to what mathematical modeling is, because as I said, it's not meant to completely recreate the thing in itself. It's meant to clarify our understanding of what we're studying by highlighting specific relevant elements and ignoring ones that would only complicate the picture. So in general, that's, as I said, one of the themes of the book and what I hoped to get across with the difficulty of modeling the brain, but also kind of the artistry of it in choosing or being very clear on what you're trying to explain and being able to see through all the data to get at the components that really matter for what you're trying to explain. So yeah, with that, thank you for your attention and happy to start the discussion.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, amazing summary of many things, many principles, and you highlighted different important ones there. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so I'll remind anyone who wants to ask a question, I'll repost the link again. But I guess yeah, I have a first question. I think you started in the beginning by emphasizing something about how the models should be simplifying and compress something, and they can't concentrate on everything, so they have to concentrate on something and leave on purpose something out in order to be able to capture I guess some feature with precision. Is that a necessity for all the models, including the why question models? What do you think?
Yeah, because I mean, in the example of information theory, you're still making a very simplifying assumption that the brain is trying to be as efficient as possible, when in fact there could be a lot of other constraints that are coming into play, not just efficiency in terms of how often the neuron fires a spike. There are just other types of efficiency you can consider, and there are just other things that might not play into efficiency, but still are important for understanding why the cells respond the way that they do. And this is especially true because the ultimate why answer is evolution. And we kind of, as a shorthand, assume that evolution is optimizing. And so we can just say the brain must be doing the most optimal thing because through eons of evolution, it would land on that as the solution. But in fact, there is a specific history to all animals. And even if the optimal thing is to do something one way, if you're building on, your previous ancestors that just didn't have the parts to do it that way, then you might not get there. And so while, the optimality assumption can help in framing certain things, it's just not completely aligned with what we know is true, which is that evolution can be very messy and builds on past existing structures.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the why questions being related to something like evolution. I guess there are also side mechanisms, so epiphenomena related to evolution that might be harder to find directly by looking at the brain. So what would be the promising ones, you think, out there, or maybe things that are being tried here as a review kind of thing?
of promising to find?
I guess as if you look at evolutionary perspectives or similar, like mechanisms that led to the brain that we see in humans nowadays. So what led to that? Are there main approaches that would be answering this question apart from like pure evolutionary theory?
So I'll say that even pure evolutionary theory isn't used that much in neuroscience. Despite the fact that we know that the brain has evolved, we do kind of take it as a finished product when we study it. And there's actually a push by some people. One is Paul Chisek, who's saying that neuroscientists do need to pay more attention to evolutionary theory and actually look at the specific evolutionary history of the species that they're studying, and that might clarify a lot of things that seem confusing. So right now, there is this, trend, as I've talked about with the convolutional neural networks, of using artificial neural networks as a model of the brain for various things, not just vision. And the idea there is, you start with this network and you train it on a certain task. So you update its weights to achieve high performance on whatever task you're trying to do. And when we find that can match the brain, there is this entanglement of in what way is it recapitulating development versus evolution versus something else, because those are all kind of tied up because you're starting with this neural network from scratch. Now, the ways in which we get evolution in there a little bit is by deciding on the architecture. So the idea of using convolutions and pooling, that's something we assume is kind of hardwired into the structure of the visual system, is that it has this way of connecting cells that you get something that looks like convolution and pooling. And so there's people who are kind of trying to think about, when you design an artificial neural network, the architecture of it, what neurons should connect to what, that is a way of almost capturing what evolution provided the animal, and then training it is a way of thinking about development maybe. But even that doesn't work out exactly. And it's something that people actually have a very hard time disentangling. So in terms of, a mathematical approach to trying to understand what evolution has provided, or a modeling approach, I think it's actually pretty difficult. And, obviously there are people who do mathematical modeling of the process of evolution, and they might have something to say about it. But in terms of kind of starting with the brain and trying to disentangle what's provided by evolution and what isn't, is still tricky, and people spend a lot of time on that in terms of studying development and seeing what will arise even in the absence of experience. Certain features, including of the visual system, will occur even if you don't get visual inputs, and so those seem like they must be hard-coded in the genes, where other things do require that you actually be getting normal visual inputs to develop normally. And so that tells us that there's development as an important part there, but obviously it's driven by the genes still. So it's just an incredibly tricky thing to disentangle.
Yeah, I like this picture. I think, I guess that's what I like in artificial modeling, or I guess that allows you to capture fundamental properties of learning, even if it's not with the brain. And if you make variations, maybe you can find, so I guess in general, learning theory, as in machine learning and all of the above kind of theories, capture these kind of fundamental mechanisms linked to how to absorb information and being able to reuse it in different situations, right? Those kind of elements from learning theory, if you factor that out from your knowledge of the brain, then you should find out properties that are kind of proper to the kind of attached to the brain as a substrate for learning, as opposed to anything else that could be learning too. I guess that's one way to put the same thing.
The brain is primed to learn certain things better than others for a variety of reasons, including architecture and the learning rules that it has available. And even those differ by brain area and things like that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this, but also I see a couple of questions. So there is one from Manuel, who is asking, do you know of any famous example of theory/mathematical framework whose methods applied to neuroscience have been just useless? Question mark.
I mean, there's a lot of math that isn't applied to neuroscience for sure. I guess it's hard to pick out things because they would die in the literature. So I can't think of a famous, attempt to use math that's been useless. I mean, I think that the attempts to incorporate things about quantum effects, the way that Roger Penrose wants to link that to consciousness, is a really big example of taking something from physics and putting it into the brain and not being super fruitful, but from my opinion. So that's one of the big ones I would say. But yeah, for the most part, if it's not helpful, we don't use it. I'd like to believe that if it's not helpful, we don't use it. But maybe we'll find down the line that some of the things we've been focusing on for a long time have actually been red herrings or leading us astray.
Yeah, I guess there's part of math that is used as a tool. So something like information theory was an example that you gave, right? And so Shannon's theory was kind of necessary to make sense of certain measures, and so is part of statistics in Bayesian theory. So that's math that you use to analyze. You have to incorporate in your models to make sense of them, or you can. But I guess there is other math that, how would I say this clearly? Like we said before, it's universal truth, and you will find them if you look for them in the brain. You might find them, but it doesn't have a certain precise meaning. It's just general truth, general elements of physics, for example. You will find in the brain doesn't mean something in particular. So I guess it's tricky to, but we should differentiate between tools and truth, and mathematical things that are true.
Yeah, I mean, the brain, follows the laws of physics. So, but yeah, we don't necessarily try to think about it exactly, starting from those steps. Although people who are interested in very detailed models of individual neurons do have to kind of get down closer to that level. They are building more of just a physical simulation, whereas, some of the more, information processing, higher level cognitive things are not, they might be using math from physics, but they're using it as an analogy. They're not saying that I'm physically simulating the system from scratch. That's more the domain of single cell modelers, or even, sub that.
So we have another question from Antoine, who is asking, can Bayes' rule explain why is the perceived stimulus, left eye, right eye, alternating in a binocular rivalry situation? Is the prior alternating to, and why? So maybe we should recap what the experiment is about. So binocular rivalry. Maybe, do you want to do that too?
Sure, yeah. In binocular rivalry experiments, you usually have a subject wearing kind of goggles that will project different images to each eye. And their experience of that will alternate between seeing one image and seeing the other. And this can definitely be cast in Bayesian terms. And so you'd have kind of the data coming in from each eye. You could think about priors. Usually they're different objects that are projected to each eye to make it clear that the person is seeing two different things and when they're switching. So it might be a face in one eye and a house in another. And so there are different parts of the visual system that are dedicated to processing faces and houses. And so you can imagine that kind of those different systems maybe embed their own priors and are controlling it that way. But also the thing to remember is that the Bayesian framework is probabilistic. So, you combine your likelihood and your prior and you get a posterior distribution. And so that itself, in this case might be like a bimodal distribution that centers on house and centers on face with the two peaks. And one, when you have that distribution, that doesn't actually tell you the perception that the person will have, because that's just a distribution. And most of the time we don't experience a distribution. We experience kind of one point in the distribution. So the brain somehow is kind of collapsing that distribution and only serving up, one coherent perception. And so, but how the brain, maps that distribution to a single perception is something that is debated and can be done differently in different circumstances. So you could think of binocular rivalry, that back and forth of what you're actually experiencing is the brain sampling from that distribution, from that bimodal distribution. So at some points in time, it's sampling from the house side of it. At some points, it's sampling from the face side of it. And that's kind of how the brain in that circumstance turns a distribution into a perception.
So in that case, so the Bayes rule is somehow part of the model, you would say, or is that used as an external tool?
Yeah, so it's definitely part of the model. This is an area called like Bayesian decision theory, which is, it's based on Bayes' rule, but then it acknowledges that it has to be some mapping between that posterior distribution that you get out of Bayes' rule and, the actual report that the human gives you about what they're seeing, that's not, the distribution is not enough to explain behavior. There's some extra step that you have to apply there. And you can come up with, different reasons why you would collapse that distribution in different ways.
Yeah. And I'm asking that on purpose to talk about, I guess, whether even if your model has a feature that is, for example, Bayes' rule or something else, another mathematical element, would you have to consider that this has to be part of the model this way, literally, or of course it could be implemented by something else. It could be also a side effect of a larger physical or mathematical law. So what can we say about that? Like, is it so? If it's verified statistically that it's there, is it there?
Yeah, so this is the Bayesian approach is a good place to talk about this, because there are a lot of people who are studying how Bayes' rule could actually be implemented by neurons, by populations of neurons. And that includes how can a neural population represent a probability distribution, and then also how can it combine it in the right ways. And there is, in some ways, there is a debate about, is the brain actually Bayesian or does it approximate Bayesian inference? And to me, there's some merit in having that discussion, but at the same time, it's almost always just an approximation because it is neurons that are implementing it. It's not, symbols on a page. We're not doing integrals or anything. It's some way of implementing something like that with neurons. Now, it could be that it's really only a loose approximation in the sense that if you kind of push people out of their normal perceptual regime, it, breaks down very quickly and it doesn't look Bayesian at all, even in the behavioral sense, like even in the way that people output, what they're seeing. And so it's possible that it's super approximate, but if the behavior that you're studying is largely matching what Bayesian decision theory would predict, then the neurons are approximating that math in some way. And we can say that it's really there or not, I guess, by the extent to which it does a good job of approximating it. But in the end, it's neurons. So
yeah. So I guess there is a related question from the audience. So is there some form of bias in applying a mathematical framework to only some problems? So giving an example, we like Bayesian perception, but Bayesian firing, quote unquote, not so much. So how does that work?
Yeah. I would actually say Bayes' rule is something we've applied to a lot of things. But yes, there are obviously certain types of modeling that are more heavily used in certain subtypes of neuroscience than others. And I don't think that that's a bias. I mean, it can be the result of bias, but it's also just you should assess the situation and decide which mathematical tools and models are best suited for it. So I don't think that there's necessarily a problem with that if, the decision to use certain tools and not others is kind of based on our understanding of the data at the time. I think more where some kind of bias comes in is that people have preferred tools and then they try to apply them everywhere. And I think that is, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, that can lead to some problems if you're really shoehorning the model onto the data and it doesn't really fit. So that's kind of more where I would see a problem arising, is over application of a certain type of mathematics that only has limited use for where it's being applied.
Right. I guess if you are a mathematician, then you work from axioms, and then you reach some kind of theorem that is at the end helpful, and then maybe you reach another one. You use lemma in between. This is the kind of structure, but it does have to start from some kind of assumption of something. And I guess you give the example in your book, I think chapter 12. So in the last one, when you summarize, like I guess you give the example of a few theories out there about, especially about consciousness, and that's where I think neuroscience is struggling for very good reasons, because it comes in contact with psychology and I guess phenomenological report. Some theories impose very strongly some axioms, right? And they start from there, and maybe it's the case for all theories, but isn't that always going to be the case? And that could be considered a bias. So how do you know? I guess we can. I should name it. So I'm talking about the IIT, so Integrated Information Theory here. So when do you know that your theory has some bias? How can you test that? Is there a sort of threshold from which you should be careful about your axioms?
Yeah, so IIT does have these explicit axioms that it's based on, and they're supposed to come from subjective experience, kind of what the supporters of that theory kind of think are just the universal basics of conscious experience. And so that does have problems, because that's not taken for granted by everyone, that those are the correct axioms to start from. Aside from some other issues that people have with the theory, just the basics of choosing those axioms are up for grabs, and how those axioms are then turned into math. But I would say most mathematical theories of the brain don't start with axioms. I mean, there's some of these more normative models, like information theory, where you're making assumptions and assuming the brain is optimal. They're probably closer to being described as axiomatic. But a lot of the other approaches are kind of, we observed this in the data, and we're just going to come up with a mathematical description of the data. And in that way, they're very post hoc, and sometimes are criticized for being that. They're not based on these like solid foundations where you're just deriving from nothing, how the brain should be. They're descriptions. They're just descriptions that instead of writing in words, you write in equations. And so I think that describes a lot of the models that are used in neuroscience and psychology. And yeah, they can still have their own types of bias if people, as I said, are interested in using a certain type of math, regardless of whether it really fits the data. But the way that you battle that is that you always have to come back to data. You have to build a model that can either predict or post-dict, as some people say, data that has been found, experimental studies. And so you build a model based on some subset of the experimental literature that you've read. And then hopefully, if you, run that model and explore it, and it leads you to some sort of understanding or hypothesis, you can look broader in the literature to see if that's supported already, or you can do new experiments to test the hypotheses that your model generates. And, in an empirical science like neuroscience, like that's all that matters in the end. And so in that way, some of the values from pure math don't apply super well, because the only thing that matters in the end is that you're, accurately understanding and predicting the brain. And whether or not you have a nice axiomatic basis for that doesn't really have to come into play.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it's very tricky, as I understand, and I guess defining what a good and a bad models might be is kind of an empirical question in some cases for neuroscience, and it should be based on data. I have a book here which is not yours. It's Stephen Hawking's The Grand Design, and he defines a good model as a model that has 4 properties. I'm just quoting here. If it's elegant, 2, if it contains few arbitrary or adjustable elements. 3, it agrees with and explains all existing observations. It's important. And 4, it makes detailed predictions about future observations that can disprove or falsify the model if they are not borne out. So I wonder in this this kind of, well, rather broad, but still like also an elegant definition. Oopsie. Is there something in neuroscience that differs from this kind of physics-oriented kind of definition of a model? Is there some kind of distinction that we have to go through because we are talking about the brain here? It's kind of a different object. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think broadly it's the same criteria. Elegance is subjective, and so what neuroscientists are going to consider elegant is going to be different than what physicists consider elegant, and it's kind of based on probably the distribution of conceivably correct models that you see. Like the brain is going to take more complex models to explain it, and more diversity of models. You're not going to have like the 3 fundamental laws of the brain. And so also I think in the third point, he was saying that it should explain all available data, and that's just not at all a criteria in models of the brain. Even for the brain area you're trying to model, there's no expectation that you're going to explain all available data in a single model. And because, that's related to this idea that you're focusing on different aspects of what the brain is doing in that given time and kind of what level you want to understand it on. There's this notion of Mars levels, named after David Marr, which is, we have the computational level, what is the goal of this brain area? What is it trying to actually achieve for the organism? And then there's the algorithmic level, which is what is the steps does it take to achieve that goal? And then the implementation level is how are the actual neurons taking those steps? And so people can, be studying any of those levels. And if you're aiming for an algorithmic explanation, you're not really, required to explain all of the neural data, because that's more at the implementation level. And even if you're trying to explain neural data, you're not expected to explain all of neural data. It's just there's too many angles you can look at the brain from. No one's trying to make like a full picture.
Yeah, very interesting. I guess one last point on I guess the math in math model. And it's in relation with the blog post you wrote about. I should quote your title here. Is math invented or discovered? An argument for invention. And with relation to your ideas there. So I guess all the general thought is that math could be a property of our universe that we are discovering as we go, and therefore all of the math we are using for our models is also is discovered, but on the other hand it could also be invented as we go, and you make an argument that it's part of that we can tell them apart if they are the only possible ingredients that could, I'm paraphrasing, that we could use to make a prediction. How does that fit in the scheme of these mathematical models?
So I think my, kind of take on that, invention versus discovery thing is that ultimately, invention and discovery converge a little bit in my mind, because if there is kind of only one way to solve a problem, would you say that you discovered that way or that you invented a way? If you're solving a problem, we normally talk about that in terms of invention. I invented a solution to this. But if it happens to be that solution is the only possible one, then I think, it wouldn't be crazy that people talk about discovery as, they've discovered the solution. So I think they do kind of converge depending on how many possible answers there are. With, the brain, I think we would talk about mathematical models of the brain more as invented, because we acknowledge that there are multiple different possible models that can be used to explain similar stuff. Yet when we talk about the brain itself, we talk about more about discovery, because there is kind of only one way that the brain really is. And maybe that's kind of inappropriate, even from like a experimental data perspective. Maybe we should talk about that more as kind of, I invented this way of summarizing the data that seems useful. It's possible that would actually be more accurate, because the brain just, is what it is, and all of science, is trying to come up with stories we can understand about the things that we're looking at. But then maybe we could never use the word discovery. So maybe it's fine. It's fine as it is that we say we discovered things when we're talking about data, because that's how the thing is. And we kind of invented models that help us conceptualize that data even more.
Yeah, you're right. It might be very close to the semantics, and I guess all of science is a matter of perspective, and it's everything is also experiential. So we experience the world out there, and everything has to go through our eyes or our senses, I guess, to make sense to us by definition. So I guess there are different ways to look at the data in the first place about the brain, and maybe we are victims of that, but that's the way that's the way we can observe the world. So that shouldn't be a limit. But is there how does that relate with the theories being grand theories, and being I guess in the grand scheme of science being more and more universal, and maybe bridging between theories, and that's something that we try to do in physics, but we definitely want to bridge between the different grand theories in neuroscience. So how can we achieve that? And what's the, and maybe that's a good occasion to. I think there was a question about this too. I think it started from the Bayesian brain. So this question. You said that each of the three approaches is missing something. What is it from your perspective that the Bayesian brain is not covering? And I guess that's a chance to recap how those approaches match or not, I guess, or are not matchable at all.
So the Bayesian brain in particular, so that is something that would be considered, an algorithmic level description of what the visual system is doing. And so one thing that it is missing, though, as I said, people are working on, is the neural implementation of how the brain would actually implement Bayes' rule. That's one thing. And related to that a bit is, this calculation of the likelihood of the likelihood of the data given the hypothesis is actually a very difficult thing to calculate. And so that's one that's particularly odd to try to sort out for anything but the most simple perceptual situations. So that's kind of something that is missing. And also it's just, again, if your goal is to predict neural data, there are some elements of neural data that can be predicted broadly by a Bayesian framework, but you can't, we don't really have a lot of models right now that work according to Bayesian principles, where you can actually put in an image and predict neural activity in response to that image, the same way that you can with these convolutional neural networks. So just the type of data that they're trying to explain is different. The Bayesian models are trying to explain mostly, behavioral data, just like what is the output of the person, and does it align with what looks like a Bayes rule? So these aren't these large scale models that you could actually use to predict neural activity, except for maybe in some broad strokes say that, the neural activity will look this way when the prior is this, versus if it's a different prior, you might be able to say something broadly about that. So it's just different kind of levels of explanation and different types of data that they're each aiming to explain. But so the grand unified theories is tricky, because I don't know how much it comes across in the book, but I am like most neuroscientists in that I don't think there will be grand unified theories of the brain. I think that is, one of the things that we're taking from the culture of physics that doesn't actually apply. That again kind of relates to the fact that the brain is evolved and it has all these different components that are doing different things, and there's just no reason that it needs to operate according to super simple principles. But, in the end, you do want to reconcile the different models. I mean, especially if they're making explicitly contradictory predictions. But in order for them to do that, they have to both be making predictions on the same kind of data. And as I said, they're not all making predictions about the same kind of data.
Right.
And so in that way, they don't actually contradict each other most of the time. But we do have models that do have contradictory predictions, and you do need to resolve those. Or we have, lots of data that we don't have any models that can predict at all. And that's, clearly something that's missing. But the question of how you go about resolving that, it's going to still depend on what your goals are. So with the convolutional neural networks, the very basic version of them, they don't have any temporal dynamics. They're just, they give you a static prediction of neural activity. But we know that there's a lot of interesting temporal dynamics in the brain, and neurons respond differently over time and all of that. And so one thing you can do is put in recurrent connections in those models or other ways to introduce temporal dynamics. And so that's adding a bit of realism. It's just, putting in more details that might be able to explain more data. And if you kind of keep going down that road, then you're really, recreating kind of every bit of the brain by adding more of the biological details to explain more of the data. And that's one helpful way. But at the same time, I can see the desire from some people to have a more simplified kind of algorithmic level explanation of things. And so they're not going to kind of accept that big clunky model with all the moving parts as a good explanation. It might be good at predicting neural activity, but doesn't satisfy them on like kind of a simple, do I understand this or not level. So I think, ultimately we will continue with multiple different levels of modeling and multiple different angles that we're looking at the data from.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this I like the idea of having these bottom-up models and at the same time those top-down approaches, and I think we need both. And then it's tricky to define what we really understand by understanding.
I think about that a lot. Yeah,
I bet you do. It's a kind of a recurrent question. I guess self-referencing question in neuroscience. But yeah. This is I guess you definitely need both, and I do appreciate artificial models in kind of approaches, because you might be making mistakes, and it's true that even if you replicate a brain exactly, right, like molecule by molecule, you might not have learned anything. You just replicated it.
Yes.
So we definitely need an understanding of what understanding is as we progress. I guess there was a question that was related to all of this, and then maybe we should go into the emotional part. I think I saw some questions, but there is a question about what would be the string theory of neuroscience. Is there one? Are people going in that direction? And I guess, by string theory of neuroscience, I'm guessing Manuel means something about a very compressed theory, something that comes from very few rules that still gets you the whole of the properties, the whole behavior that the brain can create.
So, I mean, in some ways, string theory is the string theory of neuroscience, because if it explains all of the universe, it's going to include brains as well.
That's right.
Yeah. So, but I think, as I said, I don't think that there will be simple principles. People are putting them forth. That's what I talk about in the last chapter. So there's like the free energy principle by Carl Friston, or most closely associated with Carl Friston when it's applied to the brain, which is about making predictions and trying to reduce error as a way to explain a lot of neural data. So people do try, but I just don't think we're entitled to that. I think this sense that you're going to find that is putting on to biology and evolution an expectation that there's just no reason to have for it based on what we know about how brains and bodies came about. It's just, it feels just kind of a little wishful to me to like, wouldn't it be great if we could explain the brain with just a handful of simple principles and just combine them such that the brain emerges? But there's too many different brains. Even people in neuroscience study human brains and all the way down to C. elegans, which is a tiny worm that doesn't even really have a brain. It has 302 neurons in its total, neural system. The idea that you're going to get a whole lot of principles that are going to explain all of that and all of us, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I agree. Very difficult problem. Although, I have this tendency, but of course, I'd like to see that happen. So I guess it is by definition, what is it, or by feel what I'd like to happen to have these kind of few rules that generate all of neuroscience or of cognitive science rather. But yeah, it's not a given for sure. And yeah, talking more about the cognitive slash psychological side, I have a question here from Toya. Thank you, Grace. What do you think feeling slash emotion is? Can you model this? What are the key differences between a digital model and a natural analog brain?
So with respect to emotion, I don't find emotion to be of a very different category than anything else that we understand. People can build computational models of emotion for sure. Sometimes it's just a matter of how you're labeling what you're building. So, for example, there's a lot of work done on decision making in neuroscience and kind of seen if an animal will wait a certain amount of time to get a reward versus break early to have the opportunity to get another reward or not get a reward at all. And people will describe that as impulsivity, which is kind of an emotion. Ultimately, you're just trying to explain the behavior in the end, especially when we're working with these animal models. But people study aggression in rodents. You can very easily stimulate certain parts of the subcortical areas in the brain to create aggression in animals or create other behaviors that we would associate with strong emotional experiences like fear. And so, insofar as all of that falls under standard neuroscience that is done, it can also be modeled in many of the same ways that we model things that are more commonly called cognition. So I don't see any strong dividing line there. They might serve kind of different purposes if we're thinking about, again, evolution, and especially when we start thinking about humans, we definitely have different associations with emotion versus rationality or cognition in society, but there's still, behaviors that arise from the brain. So people definitely do model them, and you can model them with a lot of the same methods. The digital versus analog, it's complicated because, yes, when we build computational models on a computer, we're using a digital computer to do that simulation, but a lot of people still do, use continuous math as the basis of the simulation that they're building. And so people still study kind of the analog side of the brain or things that might be more associated with analog processing through mathematics. Maybe that's more of a technical detail than the questioner intended with that. But I don't really know how much else of how to think about that. There is a neurophilosopher, Corey Malley, who kind of actually studies that the difference between digital and analog computation. So that might be relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I guess this this as close as you get to anything about feelings that are subjective and consciousness, things become very tricky to talk about.
I think people just have this sense that their emotions are kind of more core to consciousness, but I think if you reflect on it, the thoughts that you're having are also your consciousness,
That's right. Yeah, you can consider things as behavioral or computational, and I think that really helps getting out of the debate, but more into the experiments. And things that are verifiable. Yeah, there's one interesting question. Let's take a couple and then maybe go into an informal, even more informal part of this event. So I'll invite in a minute people to join our Zoom link, which I already posted in the comments. It might disappear when the event ends, so make sure you copy that. And there's a question about the right level of abstraction for models of the brain. So yeah, that's I guess a fair question. So looking at the current set of models that are very promising and very helpful, what is likely to be the right level of abstraction? So is it going to be macro or so learning cognitive functions, neural networks, atomic level or quantum? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that is, the question that a lot of people are trying to answer with their research. But again, it will depend on what you're interested in explaining or understanding about the brain. And I'm totally fine with the fact that different scientists have different things that they're trying to understand about the brain, and that understanding looks different to different scientists. So there are people who do work where they, for them, they are contributing to understanding the brain, but to me, they're doing it on a level that just doesn't satisfy my questions about the brain. So what the right level is very researcher dependent and goal dependent. So, I mean, if your goal is to create artificial intelligence, then, that'll narrow it down a bit. We don't think you need to go to the atomic or quantum level to create artificial intelligence. You don't have to understand the brain on that level to be able to replicate the kind of intelligent functions of the brain. But what level you do have to understand it on is evolving constantly. So, for example, with the question of learning, most of these artificial neural networks, they use what are called point neurons, which means they use a model of a neuron that has no internal structure or any interesting dynamics on its own. It just is an input-output function, like a rectified linear unit. But real neurons, biological neurons, have shapes and different anatomy and processes and different, proteins and neurotransmitters and all these things that impact their function. And they can, on their own be like mini artificial neural networks in the complexity that they're able to do in their input-output transfers. And so people are now, in terms of trying to understand how biological learning could happen and how the brain can be so good at learning, they're realizing that the structure of the neurons could matter, and that the information that you get to like the base of the neuron can be different than the information that some of its processes at the top get. And that can allow, things like error calculations or updating weights based on errors that come from later in the network. And these things that, are normally done through backpropagation in artificial neural networks, people are understanding that the brain might be using the anatomy of neurons to do some of its learning. And so that says that the point neuron abstraction is not appropriate if we really want to understand learning in the brain. And prior to, somewhat recently, a lot of people have always argued that, we have to think about neurons in their full complexity. So it's not that recent, but, the trend of really proving that this anatomy is related to learning and is crucial for learning is somewhat recent. And so it's kind of a revision of the idea that you can understand the brain as a bunch of point neurons and that you'll be able to get strong artificial intelligence at that level of understanding. So it's definitely just an open question that's constantly evolving. What level, what amount of detail do we have to incorporate? And that's exactly what the process of modeling is kind of iterating on that question until you find the amount of detail that explains the data that you want to explain.
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating aspect of neuroscience. It's also that parts of that are usable, actionable in artificial intelligence. You capture some of that, right? And like the convolutional neural network, deep architectures that we're seeing now that you mentioned. But not only that, I guess many models have come from what we know from nature. Okay, so this works that way. It must be efficient. Oh, yes, it is. Some of that doesn't import well. But maybe some of those, so that might be a question from me. I see a few questions that are remaining are kind of technical about applications, I guess the global summary of that might be, what are, in your opinion, theories or models that are existing in the, I guess, in the stellar system of neuroscience right now that might be the most promising to work on importing at least in the near future, if we want to get new algorithms, maybe something different from what we purely got really into with DeepMind, which is reinforcement learning and deep architectures. Is there something that we are not exploiting right now that might be a high risk, high rewards kind of domain?
I'm sure it's definitely high risk, high reward to try to map, more biological details into AI. It's in some ways, a common question. There's a lot of people doing AI now who are looking to neuroscience and, wanting to mine more of the information about neuroscience to try to put in concepts into the models that they're building for AI. And I feel like we always have to let them down a bit and just say, well, no, we don't have like super detailed algorithmic descriptions of how a lot of things work. We have more of this piecemeal, patchy understanding of different concepts that we rely on to explain data. But for the most part, neuroscientists, even computational neuroscientists, aren't trying to build full models that can really do exactly what the animal is doing, for better or worse. And the influx of using these trained artificial neural networks recently is moving us more towards the direction of actually making sure that the model that we're interested in can do the full complex task that we're asking of the animal. But we don't, we have these bits and pieces, but we can't actually give like a full, step-by-step procedure to explain how things should be put together to create artificial intelligence, partly because it hasn't been the focus and partly because it's hard. And that's why we don't have artificial intelligence that's like super human-like yet. So one thing that people have actually been doing that has proven maybe a little bit successful that I've observed is that actually the inspiration is coming less from neuroscience and more from psychology, like concepts of attention and other things that have been translated into certain AI models. It's more, what are the functions, what are the patterns that I see in human intelligence, and how can I broadly make something that will do something like that? People don't seem that interested in the exact details of how, attention is implemented in the brain. They just take the concept of attention and put something in their model that they think could do it. And in a way that makes sense because insofar as the current AI that we have is still so different from the brain, there's no reason to think that the fine-scale details from the brain will be able to transfer directly. So taking more abstract, high-level inspiration does seem to make a little bit more sense because that's the level at which they're kind of converging. In the case of these convolutional neural networks where you can predict neural activity with the artificial neural networks, maybe there's a little bit more motivation to try to be more fine-grained in what you're taking and putting into the AI. And people do that more in visual processing because there's more of a direct comparison. But the complication there is that the way that the brain solves it, while it may be efficient for the brain, is maybe not the best thing for our current computers. So for example, we know that the brain uses a lot of recurrent processing in the visual system, and that might be, why the brain isn't subject to adversarial examples or other issues that come up with convolutional neural networks. But training a recurrent neural network, a big, huge, deep recurrent neural network, is very difficult, or, it's not the most efficient way. And so people have turned to things like transformers that kind of give you some of the benefits using a very different architecture to do it. So the transfer is hard because the models aren't similar enough. Like, the brain and the AI models aren't similar enough. The one other thing I would say on it that is just something that maybe people haven't thought of is that actually the fruit fly, Drosophila, is studied a lot in neuroscience, and it seems to have some very nice, simple principles for how it does certain basic tasks that maybe would be good inspiration. And I saw someone shared a paper on Twitter the other day about some algorithm that was discovered in the fruit fly for how the fruit fly does olfaction, like sensing smells. And that was able to improve some algorithm that people were using. And so the fruit fly, insofar as it's, it has much fewer neurons and it has more genetically defined neural pathways. It's kind of, each fly is more similar to each other than different humans are. It's kind of easier to find these simple algorithms embedded in the fruit fly brain than it is in mammals. And so there could actually be, some more interesting things to come out of the fruit fly, at least sooner than, what we're going to get from studying human brains.
Oh, that's interesting. So I haven't seen that. And yeah, we should definitely chat about that in the discussion right after. Yeah, I guess it's a good idea to look at those I guess cuts or high level abstractions like you said about those models of the brain and try to capture things that way and import them into AI techniques. I've seen some of that done with the free energy principle, even IIT, or what is it, the other one that you mentioned, the thousand brain thing. So I guess that's the basis of Numenta. And I guess if you have a good idea, there you go, you have an AI company. Maybe it doesn't mean that it's something that is going to work, but it's good to try it out. It connects nicely with CrossLab, and we try to find bind-inspired features that would work out. And I don't believe that we should believe very strongly in just one of them, but keeping doing that, and also not favoring too much the ones that already we know that work. We should have a more diverse set that we consider interesting. I take often the comparison of the how Copernicus found his theory, and it's not because he was alone. There was a community that was searching for the same thing, and it just happens that his theory was the one that was recognized and correct. But I guess we should work like this as a community, and I see a lot of trend in neuroscience okay, so this is the right picture, or people tend to believe. It's fascinating. I didn't know that, but you mentioned in your book, also towards the end, about which theories were perceived as the most promising. And it's not the ones that are the most promising by experts, but from the outside, I think non-experts found that the IIT, so the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness, was the most promising in those kind of theories. I guess that's very surprising, and it's maybe partly PR. I don't know exactly what, but I guess you find that on all areas of science. I guess all of that is kind of revealing about how science has become a world brain activity. So we have attention being focused on different areas, and it's important to also maintain this diversity somehow, and this curiosity, and not just focus on whatever is giving you the most publications right now, which is, I guess, a challenge. All right, so many more questions. I apologize for those that we haven't replied, but we have a chance to address them right after this. So please join. I'll post the link once more here in the chat. There we go. So yeah, please feel free to join. And Grace, thank you so much again for joining. And yeah, let's continue in a few seconds.
Cool, thank you.